The battleship moved through darkness like a ghost, her engines barely audible as she slipped her moorings and glided downstream through the harbour at Danzig. It was 0430 hours on September 1st, 1939, and aboard the Schleswig-Holstein, 300 heavily armed German assault troops waited in the holds below decks, their weapons ready, their orders clear. The ship had arrived 5 days earlier on what was officially a goodwill visit, ostensibly honouring the memory of sailors from the German cruiser Magdeburg who had died 25 years ago and were buried in the city. Thousands of residents of the free city of Danzig had waved welcomes as naval cadets lined the decks in ceremonial salute. Nobody suspected that this obsolete battleship, a relic from before World War I, that had been converted to a training vessel, carried an invasion force hidden in her belly. At 0447 hours, as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Kapitan Zur See Gustav Kleikamp gave the order. The 11-inch guns of the Schleswig-Holstein erupted at point-blank range, hurling shells into the Polish fortifications at Westerplatte less than a mile away. The thunderous bombardment shattered the morning silence and sent a message racing across Europe and around the world. World War II had begun. The first shots had been fired, and an elderly battleship that should have been in a museum had just guaranteed her place in history as the ship that started the deadliest conflict humanity had ever known. The story of how an aging German battleship came to fire the opening shots of World War II begins not with military strategy, but with geography, politics, and the unfinished business of the previous war. Poland has always occupied a dangerous position in Europe, its fertile plains stretching between Germany and Russia, its borders shifting with every conflict, its people subjected to invasions and partitions throughout history. The Polish nation is ethnically diverse, with populations of Polish, German, and Russian origin living in overlapping communities that created tensions whenever nationalist movements demanded that borders match ethnic identity. After World War I ended in 1918 with Germany defeated and Imperial Russia collapsed into revolution, Poland was reconstituted as an independent nation under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. But the borders drawn by diplomats in Paris created problems that would fester for 2 decades. Under the Versailles Treaty territory that had been German West Prussia was transferred to Poland, giving the newly independent nation access to the Baltic Sea through what became known as the Polish Corridor. This strip of land separated German East Prussia from the rest of Germany, a geographical absurdity that infuriated Germans and became a source of constant resentment. At the northern end of the Polish corridor, the major port city of Danzig was designated a free city under League of Nations protection, theoretically independent, but administered by Poland to ensure Polish access to maritime trade. The population of Danzig was overwhelmingly German-speaking and culturally German, and they considered themselves unjustly separated from their homeland. The entire arrangement was a compromise that satisfied nobody and guaranteed future conflict. For Germans, the loss of territory under the Versailles Treaty was a national humiliation. The treaty had stripped Germany of colonies' territory, military power, and pride. The Weimar Republic that governed Germany through the 1920s struggled under impossible reparations payments and the stigma of defeat. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, Germany's fragile economy collapsed. Unemployment soared, and political extremism flourished. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, promising to restore German greatness, overturn the Versailles Treaty, and reunite all German-speaking peoples under one Reich. Hitler's propaganda machine relentlessly promoted the idea that Germans living under Polish or Czechoslovak rule were oppressed minorities who needed liberation. By the late 1930s, Hitler was ready to act on those promises. In 1938, Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia surrender the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. Britain and France, terrified of another war, capitulated at the Munich conference, agreeing to Hitler's demands in exchange for his promise that this was his last territorial claim in Europe. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming he had achieved peace for our time. Within 6 months, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his promises were worthless. The Western democracies had been played, and Hitler knew they lacked the will to stop him. Poland was next on the list. Throughout 1939, Hitler's propaganda intensified its focus on the Polish corridor and Danzig. German newspapers published stories often fabricated or exaggerated about Polish persecution of German minorities. Hitler demanded that Poland return Danzig and grant Germany extraterritorial access across the Polish corridor to reconnect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. The Polish government, backed by security guarantees from Britain and France, refused. Poland had only been independent for 20 years and was not about to surrender territory and sovereignty without a fight. By August 1939, war was inevitable. German forces mobilized along Poland's borders, and Poland responded with partial mobilization of its own army. But Poland faced an impossible strategic situation. Its borders were long and difficult to defend. Its military was outmatched in equipment, training, and doctrine. The Polish Air Force still relied on obsolete fighters. The Polish army had cavalry units that would face German panzer divisions. Poland's only hope was that Britain and France would launch immediate offensives against Germany from the west, forcing Hitler to fight a two-front war. That hope would prove tragically misplaced. On August 25, 1939, the battleship Schleswig-Holstein arrived in Danzig on her supposed goodwill mission. She was an anachronism, a pre-dreadnought battleship launched in 1906, representing a design philosophy already obsolete when she was commissioned. During World War I, she had served in the North Sea and fought at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where she was damaged by British shellfire. Under the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty, Germany was allowed to keep only a handful of capital ships, and the Schleswig-Holstein was one of them retained, because her obsolescence made her militarily insignificant. By 1935, she had been converted into a training ship for naval cadets. Her main armament was reduced to 4 11-inch guns and 10 6-inch guns supported by a small number of anti-aircraft weapons. At 13,200 tons displacement, she was less than half the size of the modern battleships being built by Britain, Japan, and the United States. She was slow-old and should have been scrapped years earlier, but she had one advantage: nobody considered her a threat. The Schleswig-Holstein moored under the walls of Westerplatte, a small peninsula at the entrance to Danzig harbour, where Poland maintained a military transit depot and a small garrison. The Treaty of Versailles had permitted Poland to station a limited number of troops at Westerplatte to protect Polish shipping and cargo moving through Danzig. The fortifications were modest, and the garrison numbered around 200 men under the command of Major Henryk Sucharski. But unknown to German intelligence, Poland had secretly reinforced the casements at Westerplatte, in violation of treaty restrictions, strengthening the concrete bunkers and improving defensive positions. The garrison was small but determined, and they would prove far more difficult to dislodge than the Germans expected. Below decks on the Schleswig-Holstein, the 300 assault troops waited. They were elite soldiers, heavily armed and trained for rapid assault operations. Their presence on the battleship was a secret hidden from the residents of Danzig, and even from most of the ship's crew. For 5 days they waited in cramped quarters, weapons oiled and ready, knowing that when the order came, they would spearhead Germany's invasion of Poland. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, while most of Europe slept, the Schleswig-Holstein quietly cast off her moorings and moved downstream to a new position with a clear line of fire to the Polish fortifications. Aboard the ship, the assault troops checked their equipment one final time. In the gun turrets, loaders prepared shells and propellant charges. On the bridge, Kapitan Kleikamp watched the eastern sky for the first hint of dawn. At 0447 hours, with just enough light to see targets, he gave the order to open fire. The first salvo from the Schleswig-Holstein's 11-inch guns was a physical shock, a thunderous explosion that lit up the harbour and sent shells screaming toward Westerplatte at supersonic speed. The shells exploded against and around the Polish fortifications, blasting craters in the earth, demolishing structures, sending up columns of smoke and dust. The bombardment continued for minutes that felt like hours, a relentless hammering designed to stun and demoralize the defenders before the assault troops landed. The sound carried for miles, waking residents of Danzig and sending them rushing to windows to see what was happening. War had come. Simultaneously with the naval bombardment, German ground forces crossed the Polish frontier at multiple points. This was blitzkrieg lightning war, a new form of warfare that emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force applied at critical points. Squadrons of Luftwaffe bombers struck Polish airfields at dawn, attempting to destroy the Polish Air Force on the ground before it could disperse and fight back. Panzer divisions, spearheaded by tanks and supported by mechanized infantry, smashed through Polish border defenses. Traditional static defensive lines meant nothing against mobile armored formations that could bypass strongpoints and drive deep into rear areas, cutting supply lines and encircling defenders. The German military had learned from World War I that frontal assaults against prepared defenses were costly and slow. Blitzkrieg was the opposite, fast, fluid, and ruthless. The greatest advantage the Germans possessed was radio communication. German tanks, aircraft, and infantry units could coordinate in real time, calling for support, adjusting plans, concentrating force where it was needed. Polish forces lacking comparable communications equipment fought bravely, but often without coordination or clear understanding of what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity. Polish cavalry units, still a significant component of the Polish army, found themselves charging German positions in attacks that belonged to an earlier century. The image of Polish cavalry charging German tanks became a propaganda symbol. Though the reality was more complex, Polish cavalry was used primarily for reconnaissance and mobility, not frontal assault, and Polish soldiers fought with desperate courage against impossible odds. At Westerplatte, the small Polish garrison refused to surrender, despite the overwhelming bombardment from the Schleswig-Holstein, despite attacks by Stuka dive bombers that screamed down from the sky to drop bombs with terrifying precision, despite repeated infantry assaults by German troops, who outnumbered them and had far superior firepower. Major Sucharski and his men held out. The fortifications that Poland had secretly reinforced proved more resilient than expected. The garrison used the terrain effectively, conducting a fighting withdrawal from outer positions to inner strongpoints, making the Germans pay for every meter of ground. For 7 days, the Battle of Westerplatte continued. It became an embarrassment for Germany, which had expected the position to fall in hours, not days. When the garrison finally surrendered on September the 7th, having exhausted their ammunition and options, the German victors were impressed by the determination of the defenders. In those early days of the war, before brutality became routine, the Polish defenders were treated with respect. Major Sucharski and his 200 surviving soldiers became prisoners of war, but they had demonstrated that Polish forces would not collapse without a fight. The Polish Navy, recognizing that it could not contest German naval and air superiority in the Baltic, dispersed its forces to sea before they could be trapped and destroyed. 3 of Poland's 4 destroyers escaped to Britain in a daring run through German-controlled waters. 2 of Poland's 5 submarines also reached Britain. The other submarines were interned in neutral Sweden, and 1 destroyer caught in dockyard repairs was unable to leave and was captured. These escaped Polish naval vessels would serve with distinction under British command for the remainder of the war, keeping the Polish naval ensign flying even after Poland itself fell. The invasion of Poland was rapid and brutal. German forces advanced on multiple axes, converging on Warsaw, encircling Polish armies, destroying communications and logistics. The Polish government and military high command fled east, hoping to regroup and continue resistance. But on September 17, 1939, those hopes were destroyed when the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, under the terms of a secret protocol known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed in August 1939 to divide Poland between them, with each power taking territory and both eliminating Polish independence. The pact, was cynical realpolitik Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union were ideological enemies, but they were willing to cooperate temporarily to advance their territorial ambitions. Caught between German forces advancing from the west and Soviet forces pouring in from the east, Poland was doomed. Polish forces fought on conducting desperate rearguard actions and inflicting casualties on their attackers, but by early October, organized resistance had collapsed. Warsaw fell on September 27th after a siege that left much of the city in ruins. Polish casualties were devastating, 300 dead, 700 wounded, and 587,000 prisoners captured by Germany, with another 100,000 captured by the Soviet Union. German casualties were relatively light, 16,000 dead and 32,000 wounded, though far higher than Hitler had expected for what was supposed to be a quick campaign. Soviet casualties were nominal, as their forces encountered less organized resistance in eastern Poland. But the Polish military story did not end with the fall of Poland. Approximately 200,000 Polish servicemen managed to escape to France and Britain, where they reformed under Allied command. Polish pilots would become some of the most skilled and aggressive fighter pilots in the Royal Air Force. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, when Germany attempted to gain air superiority over Britain as a prelude to invasion, Polish fighter squadrons scored some of the highest kill ratios in fighter command. Some historians argue that without Polish pilots, the Battle of Britain might have been lost, leaving Britain exposed to invasion. Polish soldiers would fight in North Africa, Italy, and France. Polish intelligence officers would work with Allied codebreakers, making crucial contributions to breaking German codes. Poland may have fallen, but Polish resistance continued for the entire war. Meanwhile, Britain and France, honouring their security guarantees to Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had failed catastrophically. The promises Hitler made at Munich were exposed as lies. War had come despite every effort to avoid it. In Australia, Prime Minister Robert Menzies broadcast to the nation on a quiet Sunday morning. "Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war." Australia, like other Commonwealth nations, entered the war automatically when Britain declared war. A generation that still remembered the horrors of World War I now faced another global conflict, and this time it would be even worse. The Schleswig-Holstein, having fired the first shots of World War II, continued to serve in the German Navy, though her obsolescence limited her usefulness. She participated in Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Norway and Denmark in April 1940, providing fire support for ground troops. She conducted training missions and coastal bombardment missions throughout 1940 and 1941. But by late 1944, with Germany facing defeat on all fronts, even obsolete battleships could not be spared from combat. The Schleswig-Holstein was berthed at the German-occupied Polish port of Gdynia when British aircraft attacked in December 1944. Bombs struck the ship, killing 28 crew members and setting her on fire. She was attacked again in March 1945, and the burning ship was scuttled near the port to prevent her from blocking the harbour. After the war, Soviet forces salvaged the wreck and beached it for use as a target for naval gunnery practice. The ship that started World War II ended her days being blown apart by Soviet shells, a fitting if ignoble end for a vessel that had outlived her purpose decades earlier. Kapitän Zay, Gustav Kleikamp, who had commanded the Schleswig-Holstein during the attack on Westerplatte, survived the war. He was captured by British forces in May 1945 and served 2 years as a prisoner of war. He was released in 1947 and died in September 1952. His place in history is secure. He gave the order that fired the first shots of World War II, but his legacy is complicated. He was a professional naval officer following orders in a war he did not start, but those orders initiated a conflict that would kill over 70 million people worldwide. The free city of Danzig, which Germany seized immediately after invading Poland, suffered extensive damage during its liberation by Soviet forces in 1945. The medieval architecture that had made the city beautiful for centuries was reduced to rubble in house-to-house fighting. After the war, Danzig reverted to Polish control and was renamed Gdansk. The German population was expelled or fled, and the city was repopulated with Poles, many of them refugees from eastern Polish territories that had been annexed by the Soviet Union. Gdansk was rebuilt slowly over decades, with many historic buildings reconstructed from old photographs and architectural plans. In 1980, Gdansk became famous again as the birthplace of the Solidarity movement. Lech Walesa, a shipyard electrician, co-founded Solidarity as an independent trade union that challenged communist control of Poland. The movement grew rapidly, gaining millions of members and forcing political concessions from the communist government. Solidarity's success inspired similar movements throughout Eastern Europe, contributing to the eventual collapse of communist regimes across the region between 1989 and Lech Walesa became president of Poland and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the peaceful transition to democracy. As of 2016, a frail but proud Lech Walesa still lived in his beloved Gdansk, the city where World War II began, and where decades later the movement that helped end the Cold War was born. On the green mound above the harbour, where the Schleswig-Holstein once fired her guns, a monument now stands at Westerplatte commemorating the Polish soldiers who held out for 7 days against overwhelming odds. The monument is stark and powerful, a testament to courage and sacrifice. Tourists visit from around the world, standing where the First Battle of World War II was fought, trying to comprehend what happened here and what it meant. The Polish people suffered terribly during World War II. 6 million Polish citizens died, including 3 million Polish Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Warsaw was systematically destroyed. Entire villages were wiped out in reprisal actions. Poland endured occupation by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, both brutal in different ways. The sacrifices of the Polish people during World War II were enormous, and the monument at Westerplatte honours those sacrifices. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein is largely forgotten today, except by naval historians and World War II scholars. She was an obsolete ship that happened to be in the right place at the right moment to fire the opening shots of history's deadliest war. Her crew did not know when they opened fire at 0447 hours on September 1st, 1939, that they were beginning a conflict that would engulf the entire world, kill over 70 million people, devastate cities and nations, and reshape the global order. They were following orders, executing a mission, doing their duty as they understood it. The moral responsibility for World War II does not rest with them, but with the leaders who planned the invasion, the ideologues who promoted conquest and racial hatred, and the politicians who failed to stop aggression before it became unstoppable. World War II was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people: Hitler's decision to invade Poland, Stalin's decision to collaborate with Hitler through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Chamberlain's decision to appease Hitler at Munich, the collective failure of the international community to enforce the Versailles Treaty or establish effective collective security through the League of Nations. Each decision seemed rational or necessary or unavoidable at the time, but in aggregate, they produced catastrophe. The first shots fired by the Schleswig-Holstein were the culmination of 2 decades of failed diplomacy, rising nationalism, economic crisis, and the unfinished business of World War I. The lessons of World War II remain relevant today. The war demonstrated that appeasement of aggression does not preserve peace, but merely postpones conflict while making it worse. It showed that international institutions are only as strong as the political will of their members to enforce their mandates. It proved that nationalism and ethnic identity politics can be weaponized by demagogues to justify territorial expansion and atrocities. It revealed that technological change can transform warfare faster than societies can adapt, making conflicts more destructive and unpredictable. and it confirmed that ordinary people, when confronted with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of both tremendous courage and terrible cruelty. The Polish garrison at Westerplatte, outnumbered and outgunned, chose to fight rather than surrender immediately. They held out for 7 days knowing they could not win, but determined to make Germany pay for every metre of ground. That kind of courage in the face of hopeless odds is rare and deserves to be remembered. Major Henryk Sucharski and his men became symbols of Polish resistance, proving that even overwhelming military superiority cannot guarantee quick or easy victory if defenders are determined enough. 85 years after the Schleswig-Holstein fired her first salvo at Westerplatte, the world remembers September 1st, 1939, as the day World War II began in Europe. The invasion of Poland set in motion events that would lead to the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the entry of the United States into the war, the Holocaust, and ultimately the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The war would introduce new horrors: strategic bombing of cities, industrial-scale genocide, atomic weapons, and it would end with Europe divided by the Iron Curtain and the beginning of the Cold War. None of that was foreseeable on the morning of September 1st, 1939, when the first shells from an obsolete battleship crashed into Polish fortifications. But history's great tragedies often begin with small acts that seem insignificant until viewed in retrospect. The Schleswig-Holstein was just a ship, old and obsolete, crewed by men following orders. But she was in Danzig harbour on September the 1st, 1939, and she fired the first shots, and that makes her historically significant. The ship that started World War II reminds us that history turns on moments, decisions, actions that cannot be undone. Once those first shells left the barrels of her 11-inch guns, there was no calling them back. War had begun. The world would never be the same. And an aging battleship, a relic from an earlier age of warfare, earned her place in history as the vessel that fired the opening shots of the deadliest conflict humanity has ever known.